Hi everyone, welcome to day 2 of SCCS-Bengaluru 2021. We start our day with a plenary. Our plenary today is by Dr. Arjun Srivathsa, and his talk is titled The Dog and the Funny Bone. I will let Arjun explain what that talk is going to be about. But before that, we have Priya who will be introducing Arjun. Over to you, Priya.
Hi, it's great to be at SCCS-Bengaluru once again. And this SCCS is particularly exciting for me because today I'll be introducing someone who I've known for many years as a friend, a colleague, someone who sets deadlines and actually believes in living up to them, and an exceptional scientist, and someone who likes to call himself a dog biologist. But don't be fooled by this person's young looks. Arjun is a phenomenal carnivore ecologist, and he's worked across India. And while some of you may know him, others may not. But what most of you would have come across is either at least one of his publications. He's someone who churns out publications on a regular basis, and that too in high impact factor journals. So his work encompasses a wide range of topics, but a recurring theme in that work is population estimation studies and studies that involve species distribution modeling. No doubt, these are complex topics to comprehend for most people. And that's where Arjun's skill as an artist comes into play, because he uses a combination of digital art and these very witty caricatures to communicate this complex science to a large number of people. And today he's going to be talking about himself as a carnivore biologist and himself as a science communicator. So please join me in welcoming Arjun Srivathsa, a man with the persistence of a great scientist and someone with an incredible sense of humor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, you are.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us early in the day on day 2 of SCCS. This is just a screen I've inserted there. I mean, it's good advice if you want to take it, but this was just to make sure that the Zoom share screen thing is working. So I'm going to start my talk with a confession. I must submit that when the SCCS people asked me to give a plenary talk, I was convinced that it was an April Fool's joke, that they were playing on me like a couple of months late because of the COVID lockdown and everything. Because like, have you seen the other speakers in the lineup? It's just like, I'm not even vaguely in the league of these people. They're all exceptional, amazing people. And so, which is why it sort of sent me into a tizzy of like, really, you want to give me a plenary talk? And like, you know, it needs to be like a moving, motivational talk and all of that. And my apprehension was not unfounded, because this is a picture of me presenting as a student at this conference exactly 8 years ago. So it was a little hard for me to believe that I'm going to be giving a plenary talk at the same conference, right? But then when these SCCS people told me that, no, it's not a joke, like we're really serious and we want you to talk, I thought, okay, so here's an opportunity. I'm going to have like a captive audience of about maybe 200, 300 people. I am going to just unleash and randomly talk about things in my notebook and various musings that go on in my head. So with that, let's all reorient ourselves and let me welcome you all to my not a plenary, okay? So we're clear on that. Before we move ahead, I'm going to give a bit of background about where I'm coming from. I earned a master's degree in wildlife biology and conservation from NCBS in Bangalore. And then I went on to get a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida. And I currently work as a research associate with the Wildlife Conservation Society India. Now, if you're already wondering why I keep making these dog references and keep referring to dogs in all of my slides, it's because I'm obsessed with dogs. And this obsession can be traced back to my childhood. And I think it's a trait I inherited from my father, who's also extremely dog crazy. So here's a picture of me from many, many years ago, smothering my dog from back in the day with a lot of love. But I don't know if he's enjoying that, but nonetheless. So at least for my parents, it came as no surprise when, as a grown-up, I continued to chase dogs, except it was no longer the domestic ones, but it was of the wild kind. So for those of you who don't know, what I'm looking at in this picture through my binoculars is a group of Asiatic wild dogs, also called the dhole. Oh, and that picture of the dhole is not mine. It belongs to Uday Kiran. So thanks to Uday for that beautiful picture. Now back to dholes. The dhole is a carnivore that belongs to the dog family. It lives in the forests of South and Southeast Asia. India is, of course, a very important country for dholes. And I mean, needless to say, I find dholes extremely adorable and cute, and as you can see from this picture. Dholes are social animals. They live in groups called packs. Packs can have anywhere from 2 to 25 members, but most packs have around 6 to 8 members. The unfortunate thing is that the dhole is an endangered species. We believe right now that there may be somewhere less than 10,000 dholes left in the wild. And of these 10,000, there may be around 1,000 or 2,000 of them that are adult, mature individuals that are capable of breeding, right? So this animal sort of caught my fancy about 10 years ago, and I decided that I want to know everything about it. I want to study this animal, I want to find out things about it. And incidentally, that happened to be the same time in 2011 that I was setting out to start my own MSc dissertation project. And I landed up in Bandipur Tiger Reserve in South India. And this place has a lot of dholes. And I wanted to find out everything about the dhole from this place. I wanted to know where they're found, where they're not, what's important to them, what's not, what are their threats, what do they like, everything. Wow, 2011 is quite a lot of years ago. Anyway, so what I did end up doing was walk 900 kilometers along every road inside Bandipur, looking for indirect signs of dholes. And when I say indirect signs, let's face it, basically what I'm doing is on a poop hunting mission, right? So looking for dhole poop and their track marks and occasionally bumping into a pack or two, but mostly trying to find their poop. So using this information on their track marks and their poop, I was able to map across the entire reserve locations where dholes use the areas a lot versus those areas where they don't use a lot, right? So this helped us figure out what areas were important to them, what areas were not. And in addition to that, I also found out that dholes seem to prefer those areas that had a lot of sambar deer. And they tended to avoid those areas that had a lot of cattle activity, you know, the cows from the villages that would go grazing in the borders of the forest. So all of this was great, and I was pretty chuffed that, oh, these are new insights about dholes, and we didn't know about them, you know, pretty exciting for a species that I was really fascinated by. But over time, I started to also realize that, hold on, this is information about one species from one location, and that too, it's a protected area. What about other species that belong to the dog family? What about other locations? What about outside of these protected reserves? What's happening there? Do I even know anything about this? So, and that takes us to the second part of the story, where I take you to the heart of central India, to the Kanha Pench landscape. This entire area is about 9,000 square kilometers in size. It has the Kanha Tiger Reserve and the Pench Tiger Reserve and this huge forest corridor between them, right? And this place has, this corridor area has a lot of carnivores, but it also has a lot of people living alongside. So what's happening there? Where are these carnivores found? You know, are they interacting with people and what's going on? So to find out about all of these things, we expand our lens to include more species now. So here we are focusing on Indian wolf, the dhole, of course, jackals, Indian foxes, and the striped hyena. And the first thing that we wanted to do was to map their distributions using their indirect signs. And now you know what indirect signs means, more poop. So, but I also told you that this place has a lot of people living alongside. So also we went around interacting with these people, finding out about their lives and livelihoods, what are their concerns on a daily basis. And what we found was a lot of people had concerns that had nothing to do with these carnivores, even though they shared space with them. They had issues like access to hospitals, or like their cow ran away or something of that sort. There was a subset of people also who were directly impacted by some of these carnivores. And then, of course, there was another group of people who, even though they lived in close proximity to these species, they didn't really know much about them. They didn't even know of some of their existence. They couldn't tell one species apart from the other. So it was a mixed bag of all sorts of people. So using the indirect signs and mapping the distribution of these species, what we found was that these carnivores occupy different amounts of area in the corridor. And it ranged from something like the dhole occupying very, very little amount of the area, just about 12%, all the way to the jackal, which was found all over the place and occupied nearly 86% of the entire landscape. What was also fascinating was that the forests were important for dholes, but these 4 other species, they required the forest, but also in combination with the scrub areas, the open dry lands, and the tapestry that all of these habitats created together, right? The fox seems to be a little upset, but we'll get back to him a little later. Through our interactions with people, what we also found out, what we discovered was that wolves would very frequently eat their goats. The jackals and foxes would very frequently eat their chicken. Some people were upset about it. Most of them didn't care about it. On the other hand, dholes very, very rarely attacked cattle. And this happened like generally incidentally when cattle would be grazing in the forest, and once in a while, dholes would attack them and eat them. Hyenas, being scavengers, didn't seem to attack any species and any of the livestock, and none of the people really reported hyenas to have attacked any of their livestock either. The overall takeaway for us from this entire study was that these carnivores are sort of living alongside people in this really fascinating landscape. And this is being possible because A, people are enabling them to sort of live alongside them. And 2, because there is this combination of the habitats like forests and scrub and open dry lands together that's facilitating the presence of all of these species. And unfortunately, most of the time when we think of wild areas or natural habitats, we normally think only of forests and ignore a lot of these other habitats and a lot of the species that depend on them. And that is perhaps why this fox is a bit upset, and justifiably so. Now, why is it important to think about all of these other habitats? I mean, we are not really doing anything to them, right? I mean, like forests are being cut down, yes, but who really cares about open scrub areas or dry lands or whatever? So what's happening? To find out more about that, let's head to Western India, to the state of Maharashtra. Yes, of course, Western Maharashtra is a lot more than just Bollywood and Bombay. So especially this landscape that you can see highlighted on the left side, it's around 90,000 square kilometers in size. And it's fascinating because it's got all of these different habitats like forests, open scrub, dry grasslands, and open barren areas. But it also has a lot of people, villages, towns, and cities, and agricultural areas, and also a lot of carnivores, right? And that's pretty interesting. So here we put our lens on 3 species: the leopard, which is a cat, the striped hyena, which is a hynid, and the wolf, which is a dog. So all these 3 species are found in this landscape. But what is fascinating about the fact that they're found here, and what can we know more about their habitats, right? The first thing what we found when we wanted to map their distribution is that all 3 species sort of had this amazing sort of spatial separation. The leopards, for example, were found mostly towards the left end of the landscape that had a lot of forests. The hyenas were found in the central belt that had a combination of forests and these open, dry, scrubby areas and agricultural fields. The wolves were found mostly towards the right extreme part of the landscape that had mostly open, dry grasslands, scrublands, and seasonal agriculture. So that's great. They're all there and they're found their own niches and they're all like, seemingly happy. But what's the problem? An interesting thing that happened, that started happening a couple of decades ago, is that people practicing agriculture in these areas started getting access to irrigation, right? So permanent irrigation led to changing of a lot of these scrubby areas and seasonal agriculture. Seasonal agriculture is like where you have crops a couple of months a year, but it's left fallow for the most part of the year. All of that started getting converted to these sugarcane fields that had standing crop for most part of the year. Now, by itself, this doesn't seem like anything. I mean, so what, right? People are making more money and that should be good. The unintended consequence of this is that a lot of the wolf-friendly habitats have now been changed into leopard-friendly habitats, right? So unfortunately, leopards and people have a lot more negative interactions than do wolves and people. So leopards more frequently attack livestock, they more frequently attack people. And just by changing the agricultural pattern here, inadvertently, unintentionally, what we have done is essentially change the fabric of the carnivore community here. And as a consequence, really changing the equations that people have with these carnivores. And these interactions are so complex and so intricate, and we have only just begun to scratch the surface of trying to understand any of this. So all of this was great so far because I was telling you something about dholes from South India, and we know something about them from there, and then some carnivores from central India, and something's going on with them, and then the western Maharashtra and these three carnivores. But do we have sort of a holistic idea of what is happening to all of these carnivores from a countrywide perspective? Do we even know what's going on, right? And so India has 8 species, subspecies of carnivores that belong to the dog family that you can see on the screen right now, along with the hyena. So these 9 species, they're pretty interesting species, but do we know anything about them from the entire country, and their habitats and so on? It turns out that we did not, and that's really unfortunate. So what me and a bunch of my super cool scientist friends did in 2018 was we launched the Wild Canids India project. So the aim of this project was to first build a knowledge base about all of these species and their habitats and their threats, and try to figure out ways in which we can start thinking about their conservation. So as a first order of business, we undertook citizen science surveys where we created a website and people self-reported their sightings of these species, right? And the second thing that we did was spend a lot of time digging through web portals, photo repositories, social media like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, anywhere where we could find evidence, like photographic evidence of these species being present, along with the location and the date. The third part of it is we dug through scientific literature. We gathered as much information as possible on the presence of these species from various parts of the country. Now, we put it all together, and then we mapped all of their distributions. And what we found was that different species occupied different proportions of their potential habitats, right? So some species like the desert fox that you can see on the far left were not doing all that well because they occupied only about 21% of their potential range. But on the other hand, a species like the jackal, which you can see on the far right, occupied, it was quite widespread. It was found in around 75% of its entire potential range. What was also interesting was that we found that these species, either singly or in combinations, were representative of a diverse set of habitats, like forests, of course, but also barren lands, deserts and ravines, high altitude lands and plains, scrub and grassland areas, and also agricultural fields. And none of these sort of habitats, except for forests, they don't feature at all in any of our conservation discourse. At least they don't feature adequately. And these other habitats are so important for so many species. And that also perhaps explains why that fox was really upset, because nobody really cares about these grasslands and scrublands and stuff. And what happens when we don't care or don't treat these habitats as important, we don't see the need to conserve them. So currently, a lot of these open, barren lands are treated as wastelands, and therefore they're diverted for creating really large solar farms in the name of green energy, diverted to build large industries in the name of like economic development, and also well-intentioned but completely flawed afforestation programs happen in these areas. So you don't need to keep planting trees in these habitats because they're treeless habitats mostly. And then because we have a certain notion about what it means to conserve and what it means to green something, trees are planted in these habitats to add to this fox's woes. So what we did is we combined all of the information that we had about where these species are found, where their habitats are found, and all of the threats and everything together. And we demarcated what we call as canid conservation units across the country. Now, these units are large chunks of landscape that have very good habitat and very good presence of these species, which if we set aside and conserve using these wild canids and hyenas as flagships, we would be likely, or the hope is that we could conserve entire ecosystems that are linked to these species. Most of these areas, fortunately or unfortunately, have a lot of people. So we cannot just focus on the carnivores or their habitats alone without considering the people in the landscape. So all of these species, essentially what they do is make us think hard, rethink about how we should be thinking about conservation. In this case, they're an epitome of an example of how we need to balance the needs of people, minimize their losses, while also trying to maintain these carnivores and the systems that they're linked to, and sustain this for a long time, right? And this is difficult, and we don't know how we're going to do this, but this is at least like a step in the direction where we need to be going. And also an important component of this is to continuously undertake scientific monitoring of these species from a countrywide lens. So as part of that, I encourage all of you, if you have seen any of these species in the past 6 years, to log into our website on wildcanids.net and submit your sightings. It'll help us continue to map, track, and monitor their distributions at the India level. Now, hopefully I've not already sort of bored you or put you to sleep with this strange, unusual way of presenting research. So I want to sort of shift gears a little bit here and talk about science communication, right? I'm not one to give advice because I don't think I'm qualified to do that. These are some lessons that I have learned over the past few years that have helped me better my ability in communicating my science. So hopefully some of the things that I'm talking about now will be useful to you all as well. One is aesthetics and visual appeal. As scientists, when we are being trained, it's unfortunate that very little emphasis is given on how we present and package our science. And that's really unfortunate because we're all visual learners and we tend to remember things that were visually appealing a lot more than lines of text and information, right? This, not a plenary that I'm giving, has been carefully tailored to look like they're pages from my personal notebook or a scrapbook. The idea is to break the mold. When we do something that's out of the ordinary, whether you hit the mark or you completely fall flat and it's a flop, it doesn't matter. So long as it stands out, it's likely to make an impact on your audiences. And therefore, the information that you convey alongside is likely to be retained. One thing to definitely not do is to have slides like this. Now, technically, there is really nothing wrong with this slide because it has good contrasting colors. The text is legible. There's a picture of the species that I'm possibly talking about, all of that. But what happens in a sort of like, especially in a conference sort of a setting where you have a talk after talk after talk, is that it's so cookie cutter and so similar that nobody will remember what you spoke about even 2 minutes after your talk is over, because it's already replaced by another person's talk whose slides look exactly like this, right? So hypothetically, in this slide, I may have been talking about some background information about hyenas because I did a study on hyenas and I'm asking some questions, right? Now, I could do the exact same thing. Instead, just plaster the picture of this beautiful hyena across the entire screen while I speak for a couple of minutes about how cool the hyena is and what interests me about it and what are the things that I try to explore in my research. And you don't even need too many like skills in art or graphic designing to be able to do that, right? Oh, and yeah, thanks to Kalyan Verma for this beautiful picture of a hyena. It's not mine, it's his, and I was supposed to delete this page, but okay. Number 2, personalize. Another thing that I've sort of realized over time is that me as the communicator, sometimes I'm as important as the content itself. So I can't be completely separated from it. So adding my personality to the content helps deliver my science a lot better than I would than it would if I had just like very objectively written about the science that I do, right? So I have been using cartooning and illustrations to sort of put my own spin on how I communicate my science, but it could be anything. You could do haiku or poetry or write satirical pieces that sort of challenge the norm and all of these things. But so long as there is some signature that links the way you communicate to to the person that you are, it sort of helps a little bit. So as an example, last year, I created this Twitter thread, which was a completely illustrated version of my entire PhD dissertation. Now, as much as we want a lot of people to read the dissertations that we write, spending years and months, nobody really reads these documents because they're boring and jargony, and they eventually get printed and sit in some university library and nobody will really read. Maybe even your committee doesn't read your dissertation. I don't know, right? But what did help me in this sort of endeavor to make more people learn about what I did for 5 years of my PhD was using a unique way of communicating it. So this thread, I mean, you can check it out on Twitter, was mostly illustrated. It had a couple of blurbs and it was written in a way wherein somebody who had no idea about wildlife or science could still understand it. Number 3, and an important tool in your toolkit, is humor. So now I believe that humor has the ability to sort of break barriers between us as scientists and communicators and our audience, because it sort of shatters the hierarchies and it sort of makes it a level playing field. And if I'm the kind of person who is sort of intimidated by a lot of science and information, the humor sort of helps communicate that to me a lot better than if I didn't use any humor, right? And another thing that's important about humor is that, let's face it, in conservation science, a lot of the messaging has a lot of doom and gloom stories, and people sort of start tuning it out after a while. You don't want to listen to negative things. We can't change the messaging, okay? It's important to convey how difficult and how complicated the situations are in conservation about species extinctions or climate change. But we can change the packaging a little bit by adding and sprinkling a bit of humor in what we say and the way we say it to sort of mellow the blow a little bit. This fox is being very relentless, so let's get back to him later. 4th is popular culture. Similar to humor, popular culture is another tool that we can all use. Making references or drawing similarities or drawing allegories to popular movies and music or books or quotes, all of these things, basically what they help us do is create a common thread between us and our audience, right? So I could be talking to another scientist who's an astrophysicist, for example. We may have nothing in common in terms of the science that we do, but if I make a reference to, say, a Game of Thrones or Friends or Big Bang Theory, it's likely that there will be some commonality that will help me communicate my science a little better. So I don't think we should look down on references to popular culture, and we should embrace it while we're doing science communication. 5th, and also another important one, is your target audience. Now, this entire, not a plenary, I have carefully crafted it keeping in mind that my audience today is undergrad, grad, early career professionals from cities or big towns who can speak and communicate in English and get some or most of these references that I'm making. Now, if I were to give this exact same talk to a bunch of school kids in a village or through a webinar to some college students somewhere, the presentation would look nothing like this. It would not have any of these humor. It wouldn't have these references. And that's really important. It doesn't matter how creative and innovative I am. If I create this sort of really cool looking piece of communication that does not resonate with that specific audience, then all of the effort is futile. So it's very important to keep in mind whom I'm talking to and what I'm talking to at the same time. And so that's where I bring this great reference to one of my favorite shows, The Office, where Dwight, poor thing, does not know who Justin Bieber is. And it's okay if some of you also don't know this show or the reference, but it conveys the same thing in sort of a convoluted way. Sixth, and the most important one, is collaborate. Now, I fully understand. So if you're a scientist raising funds, getting permits, implementing the project, collecting the data, analyzing the data, publishing it, and creating science communication content, communicating it, and then also affect change on ground or in policy is all going to be very difficult to do for one person. We will be spreading ourselves way too thin, and the impact is likely going to be extremely diffused. So this is where I believe the power of collaboration can kick in. A lot of us have individual strengths, and it's important to recognize where we fit in the larger puzzle and work our way towards sort of doing the best within those realms that we can. So as an example, this is a sort of a slide showing I collaborated with the wonderful folks at Last Wilderness Foundation. I created this artwork, sort of cartoons about how can people avoid getting attacked by tigers. Now, the cartoon here shows a man walking in the forest in the dark, playing Sheila Ki Jawani very loudly on his phone, the tiger getting irritated and running away. Now, this would have been as funny and it would have attracted a lot of likes and shares on social media if I just put it over there. But the fact that there was a collaboration with a grassroots NGO that has clout and traction on the ground, who could communicate with the people who are direct stakeholders in this equation, had more of an amplified impact that would not have been so otherwise if I had just stuck to, oh, I'm just an artist, I'm just going to stick to like putting my art on social media, right? The second example is from Lakshadweep, where I worked with the cool scientists of Nature Conservation Foundation to create this mascot of a square-tailed grouper called Zdan. And we also created these outreach material to sort of promote sustainable ways to harvest these fish. Again, I have never been to the Lakshadweep, and my impact over there would have been next to nothing if I thought that I'm the only person who should be able to do the research and also do the communication as well as like impact change. But a collaboration makes all of these things much more easy to accomplish. And finally, simply put, I hope a lot of you remember this story that we read as children to refresh your memory. Once upon a time, there was a dog that was chewing a bone sitting by the side of the river. He saw his own reflection and thought that, oh, there's another dog there with another bone. Why have just my own bone when I can have two bones? So he tried to snatch the bone in the reflection, and in the process, he dropped his own bone into the river and he had no bones. The moral of the story is don't be greedy. But the moral is immaterial here. The reason why a lot of us remember most of these stories from our childhood is because of how simple they were, right? And this, I think, is the essence of good science communication. The best way to communicate our science is often the easiest and the simplest way to communicate it. How can I tell what I want to tell in the simplest way possible? And I hope that that was obvious and was reflected in all of the pages that I showed you from my scrapbook today that essentially had information from 4 full published scientific papers. Okay, so this dhole seems to be getting a little restless, so I'm going to end my talk here. But before that, I want to say a huge thank you to all of my collaborators to my co-authors and my mentors whose collective efforts it has been to sort of make all of the research that I presented possible. And to all of you, please feel free to reach out to me if you have ideas on research, communication, collaboration, conservation, existential crisis, anything. I'm very happy to engage, especially with younger students who might be a little lost in the woods at this point. And thank you all for giving me this opportunity, and to SCCS-Bengaluru also. Hopefully they don't regret their decision. And with that, the Fox and I are happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Arjun, for that. Everyone, please put your questions in the Slack thread. We have some already, but I'm sure you have many more. So we'll do questions, and then maybe if there's time, I'll ask you some. So the first question is, generally dholes, I assume, are misunderstood canines like others. Also, the images we see are pack hunting images and not about bonding, family attachment, etc. Is there any way to understand more about them? Any books or publications? And a second part to this, I also think in the rush to look for charismatic species, many forget about these animals. So any suggestions on how to bring them back into the limelight of spectators and increase awareness?
Okay, so the first part of the question more about dholes, this book from the 70s by Michael Fox, The Whistling Hunters, is a great book to read about their behavior. So, I mean, I would suggest that, and also the book by Dr. AJT Johnson also has a lot of very interesting things about dholes. There's also the two documentaries by Kripakar and Senani, Wild Dog Diaries and The Pack. I think both of these do a very good job of sort of capturing the social life of dholes, along with sort of highlighting various things about their conservation as well. So that's the answer to the first part. And the second part, I absolutely agree. And I think it needs to be a collective responsibility of scientists. I think scientists have now sort of made that shift. There are a lot more people now studying non-charismatic species and ignored and vulnerable understudied habitats. I think that has expanded. But I think citizens and photographers and amateur naturalists, these are the people who need to sort of amplify the profile of these. I mean, I'm not going to call them non-charismatic. I think they're pretty cool. So yeah, these species that are not mainstream right now.
I can tell you my cat was very upset that you were spending so much time with dogs. I'll send you some photos of her reaction to your presentation. I'm not joking. I don't know if the audience was staying awake, but my cat certainly was. So our next question is, in the hill region of Uttarakhand, it's a cat question, coincidentally. In the hill region of Uttarakhand, the human and leopard conflict is increasing day by day. What do you think? What are the possible reasons? In some region, it could be habitat destruction, but what about others?
Yeah, so I can't speak much about this because I haven't worked in the landscape. But from my understanding, leopards are extremely adaptable species, and they are more likely to adapt to a lot of these changes as compared to most other species. And so long as they're living in sort of these shared spaces, I think our attempt needs to be more about how to keep people safe rather than worrying about how do we deal with the animal. So increasing safety measures for people and figuring out ways to sort of best practices to sort of avoid a leopard attack, like having something as simple as having access to toilets, for example, because so many attacks happen when people go to the fields, for their morning duties. And then that's when, because they're crouching, and that's when the leopards attack, right? So a lot of this can, I think, be solved by focusing more on people and their livestock and their property rather than figuring out, do we need to capture this leopard? Where do we move it? And then is it destruction of habitat? The leopards are there. They're there in a lot of human use areas. We need to just, I think, focus more on how to make people's lives safer rather than worrying as much about the leopards.
Thanks, Arjun. There are actually no other questions yet, but we have a flood of comments about your talk, about how it was great, that it was a creative presentation, that it was super cool, which I'm guessing that's what you were going for, and that they don't remember laughing so much during a scientific talk, a lovely presentation, lots to learn. And I think it was a really nice blend of how a plenary can also be a workshop in some sense. So
you mean not a plenary?
Yes, a not a plenary, and this is exactly what not a plenaries will now look like. So thank you for accepting our invitation and making the most of it. I think it was more than we ourselves anticipated it would be. But we do have another question. How do you look at the role of diseases for declining wild dog population in India?
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, that's a great question, and I think we know very little about it. And I think yesterday there was a great talk by one of the student presenters about prevalence of distemper in dogs in the Himalayas. I think that there needs to be more studies of this sort in wild as well as domestic species in India. Unfortunately, I think it's in a very nascent stage at this point. We don't know enough, and we only find out about a lot of these things when there's an outbreak. For example, what happened with the lions and so on. So I am no expert in disease ecology, but because those are very social, it's likely that they are interacting with domestic dogs in all of these places, and they also may compete with them for similar prey species in the borders of these forests. So yeah, there might be a lot of interaction and spread of disease, and we know very little about it. So hopefully, moving into the future, we have more of these sort of for understudied, non-charismatic, non-mainstream species. We have a lot more of these studies that explore these direct conservation questions.
Thanks, Arjun. We're going to switch gears a little bit. There's a few questions around science communication. So Vedang has said that you talk about no negative science communication. So how do we adapt the positive? How can we adapt the positive format of communication? Like in the grassland and scrubland region, the locals usually ask the question, why? Why do we protect a wasteland? So how can this conservation communication be conveyed in a positive manner?
Yeah, so that's again, I mean, it's complicated, and I'm not trained in science communication. Like I said, very open about that. A lot of these things are things that I have learned over time. And I think there are still gaps in my own understanding because, of course, I have not communicated with as many communities directly. And it would be a bit incorrect of me to sit and say that, oh, if we just do this, and I'm pretty sure they'll learn, these pastoralists will learn how to laugh at the foxes. No, I don't think that's how it works. I would say that it needs to be tailored very carefully, working with people, social scientists especially, who work closely with these people to figure out like what is the best way in which we can pitch it to them. To communicate to a regular urban audience about the importance of grasslands, it's still like we're losing our grasslands, we're losing these wastelands at such a crazy pace. For them, I know how to sort of tailor my humor, right? So which is why I was taking the help of that poor crying fox through the entire presentation as well, who was complaining a lot about his habitats.
So on the topic of grasslands, though, you mentioned about decreasing grasslands and fallow lands to solar power plants and industries. So what alternative solutions do you suggest to shift the settlements of this green energy resources, because they're important as well?
A lot of these decisions are no longer just purely ecological in nature. Conservation essentially means that we're tapping into economics, politics a lot of the times, and big businesses as well. Ideally, we need to have more like localized rooftop solars, or like, covering canals and things like that, or in big cities. Unfortunately, this whole facade of green energy has just become more about land grabbing and buying large amounts of land for setting up either windmills or the solar farms. So it's not it's not like there is no alternative, except that it just seems infeasible at this point because the investments have already been put in, and it's very difficult. Like for example, a sort of similarity is how in the US now they're removing the big dams. And it's not easy to do that. It takes a lot of money to remove a dysfunctional dam as well, right? So, and in India, these solar farms are just beginning. So it's very unlikely that something's going to stop them. What we can do is sort of figure out ways in which more of these areas can be set aside. So not the entire place is just treated as a wasteland and converted into solar farms. And also like sort of improving the quality of the EIAs and the biodiversity assessments and stuff that is done before giving clearance to these sort of projects.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm picking and choosing, by the way, Arjun. So there are a lot of questions. So if you can, after this, go to Slack and answer any that you want to elaborate your answers about, or if you that I haven't managed to ask you, please do so.
Sure.
So switching back again to science communication, how do you condense scientific work full of jargons to cool illustrations? What are some of the difficulties you face while illustrating, and what do you suggest for someone who wants to do the same? And connected to that is, when you draw something, is it for a particular purpose, or do you draw as a hobby and use them when you need? Because Neha is finding it difficult to do both research and art simultaneously. Yeah.
So the first question, sorry, can you very quickly?
So the first one was, how do you condense the scientific work into cool illustrations, please?
Yeah.
And what are the difficulties that you face? And then the other was whether you draw and then use it, or you draw for a purpose always.
Yeah. So the first part, I'm going to say that initially it was a bit of a struggle, because like even as a scientist, and I'm saying this to other scientists who are aware of what I'm talking about, you can write your entire paper, but writing the abstract is a very, very painful part of writing the paper, because you're condensing something that's about 5,000, 6,000 words to about 200 words, right? So it does take a little bit of effort. Now, if I had to sort of give, I mean, there's no one solution that I can think of, like right off the bat. But what I can think of is, for every chunk of your paper, every section of your paper, if you had to convey that to me, a person who has no idea about your field of research, in just 1 or 2 lines, what would those 1 or 2 lines be? So if you write that down, at the end of it, you're going to have about 4 or 5 lines. And those are the 4 or 5 lines that I use for illustrating, right? And also you saw that, I mean, I didn't give any citations or anything, but whatever I presented today are published things, right? All of these stories are published papers from 4 papers. I hope that it was clear that you can communicate the essence of a paper without as much as showing an AIC table and a graph and a parameter estimate as well. I'm not saying that the scientific and the statistical aspect is not important. It absolutely is. But it has an outlet. The peer-reviewed paper is where it belongs. When I'm trying to communicate it to other people, nobody's going to remember an AIC table from your presentation 2 years from now. But I hope that a lot of people will remember the crying fox from my presentation 2 years from now.
Thanks, Arjun. And the second part about whether you draw for a purpose or whether you just draw and then use it.
It's both. It's both. Yeah. So sometimes I just feel like I think of an animal and I think, oh, this is probably what its personality is like, and it's like some quirks, and then I draw it. But sometimes it's also with the specific purpose of creating some sort of a story as part of some science communication thing. Yeah.
And some other questions around, when you're communicating your findings specifically to communities that live in these landscapes, what have been some of the reactions that they face, that you've sort of encountered about your findings? And there's another more specific question about dholes and the perceptions of people who live in close vicinity, for example, in Bandipur. Mm-hmm. So a more general one and then a specific one.
Yeah. So the first one, let me again reiterate that just because I recognize that these are the things that need to be done doesn't mean that anybody can do it. At this point in my career, I don't think I have the sort of traction and what it takes to be able to effectively communicate a lot of these things directly to the communities. So which is where like all of the collaborations that I talk about come in handy. My strength, I think, has been in able to influence a more urban audience. And that's what I've mostly been tapping into. Of course, I would like to sort of expand and broaden my horizons and do these things. So I can't speak directly to that. But of course, like, I once gave a presentation where I spoke about the global seafood crisis to a bunch of people who had really nothing to do with sustainability or anything. It was a corporate crowd. Nobody had told them any of this ever. So for them, it was like just using cartoons as a way to do it. Two of them at the end of the talk said, "Oh, I'm just going to give up on seafood. I had no idea all of this was happening." If I was able to influence one person, even for a short amount of time with what I was able to convey, and this was also not my research, I don't work on marine systems. So the fact that I was able to communicate that made that much of a change. So I hope that there are more science communicators. I think that's a growing tribe in India, thankfully. There are a whole bunch of them on this in this conference also. And storytellers, Vikram is doing the workshop, and I know Pooja Gupta is here, Rohan Chakravarti is here, like amazing science communicators. So hopefully there are more people doing these collaborations and sort of putting out all of the stuff that we have in these sort of fortress of science out in various ways to different types of people. And for the local people around Bandipur, no, because they don't have too many like direct interactions with dholes in that area, at least specifically in Bandipur. A few years ago, I know that there used to be a lot of skill stealing that may still happen. So where like people just follow packs of dholes when they're making a kill, and then they sort of take the prey, because and dholes don't really attack people, so it's easy to chase the dogs away and take the wild meat. I think it still happens on occasion, but it's like not very common. And those are very, very sort of timid, and they'll run away when they see people on foot. Very, very difficult to sort of stay around them.
Okay. There's a question around citizen science. So how do you validate the data that you're collecting using the citizen science surveys to map the distribution of a species?
Yeah. So in what we did, citizen science was like a small component, and we had a handle on everybody who submitted the records. So we had a whole bunch of criteria which sort of check boxes that they had to qualify before we could sort of take that information and use it in the science, starting with basically like the group size, the location, the habitat they've described. For a lot of the people who submitted their entries, we reached out to them, we made phone calls and asked them, so is this what you saw? Can you describe it to me? And even if there was like a vague hint of a doubt, we would sort of not use that data. But it's difficult. It takes a lot of effort, and we spent months doing that.
And do you find any, this is my own add-on to this now, because it's citizen science collected data, have you faced pushback when you've presented that data to, say, government departments or anybody else where you've shared that data? So people questioning the legitimacy of it.
I know that happened recently with the bird report and some things related to that. So unfortunately, when we were just about like in the process of publishing the paper on the Wild Canids India project and working towards writing these policy documents and white papers, COVID hit us, and we have sort of taken a back seat. We're hoping to do a lot more with the kind of information that we have generated, approach like state wildlife boards and national wildlife board and say that this is what we have. I will let you all know when we move this forward. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think we can take one last question. Let me just look through them. Okay, so how about this one? Given that you said you love all dogs, wild or not, what are your thoughts and suggestions and solutions to the stray dog threat to wildlife? I'm guessing you are anticipating
It's a moral dilemma. I don't know. Like, you want me to cry live on screen here? Yeah, and it's okay. So to be more serious, yes, I think it is an issue. I think it's an issue that we have created. As much as I love even stray dogs, I mean, I won't be able to tell you what the color of the house 3 houses away from here is, but I'll be able to describe all of the 8 dogs in the 2 packs that live in 2 roads near my house. I mean, but it is a problem that we have created, and I think from an animal welfare perspective, I think our notion of what welfare is a little misplaced. I don't know if all of the sterilization thing is working. I think the answer is to not have these dogs, because more than wildlife, it's also a threat to people. The number of children that these dogs kill and like spread rabies to and other diseases, it's a humanitarian issue. It's not just, and India has the highest number of free-ranging stray dogs in the world. So it is a menace, and as much as I love them, I have to like sort of take an objective stand on that.
Thanks, Arjun. We have a question from our volunteer Rohan, so we'll squeeze that in. What do you think is the best thing to do for rewilding the wild dogs in the wild, specifically in India?
I mean, I don't know. Can you elaborate what rewilding the wild dog would mean?
I think increasing wild dog population, I'll interpret it as that.
Yeah, I mean, so I've just been the overall scientific literature on dholes is really not adequate for us to say anything confidently. A lot of the things that even I have been doing are all like sort of piecemeals of things put together from various sources. We really need better, not like more scientific work, but better, very targeted scientific work to be able to say what exactly needs to be done. But in a lot of these places, because of what we already know, sometimes it's as simple as making sure that like there are some spaces where cattle grazing cannot be allowed, so that like there is adequate wild prey and also therefore increase in wild dog populations. But of course, these are so different, and like regionally, for example, in the Northeast, this is not going to work because the dynamics between people and all wildlife, but also dholes, there is so different from what it is in Central India or South India. So what works in certain regions of their distribution range will not work in other places. But I think Southeast Asia is a place where they can do a lot because there's not that much conflict. There's not as many livestock sort of related conflict. Increasing prey base over there would be a good investment to sort of bounce back wild dog as well as other carnivore populations.
Great. Thanks, Arjun. As I said, there are more questions. I didn't get to all of them. So if you can join us on Slack and answer those, that would be great.
Sure.
But for the moment, that's a wrap on the plenary session. Thank you so much for taking us up on our invitation and for not thinking that it was a joke. And also for talking about all the things that you've talked about, including the importance of collaboration, which is not what we anticipated you might talk about when we requested you to do this plenary, not a plenary though. So thank you again very, very much. And thanks everyone who have, all of you who have joined us for this plenary session. I've requested Arjun to come and answer all of your questions, and hopefully he will. So if there are more questions, please feel free to continue adding them to the Slack thread. Next up, we have a panel discussion around the topic of decolonizing conservation, something Paula Kahumbu alluded to in her plenary yesterday evening, and that many of you might have been reading about, at least in the last year. So do head over to that Slack channel, and because that will start in 2 minutes. Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great day at SCCS.